I grew up in one of those suburbs that could have been straight up plucked out of a Hallmark movie. Rows and rows of cozy houses would line the streets, named after flowers and birds, each one painted in this soft pastel shade, with matching shutters and little white fences enclosing perfectly trimmed lawns. My friends and I all lived within shouting distance of one another. Brandon, who was my next door neighbor, was like my brother. Summer days were for racing bikes around the cul-de-sac, squinting against the sun to see who could skid the longest without wiping out. There wasn't much to do otherwise, not unless you wanted to risk the kind of trouble that would get your name muttered at the PTA meetings. So that meant we had to get creative. Brandon's backyard changed everything though. So one day, just as school had let out for the summer, his dad had come home with this big shiny trampoline in the bed of his truck. It was massive, black with blue padding, and the edges were wrapped in that safety netting that wouldn't last more than a week after we got our hands on it. So it wasn't long before that trampoline became the centerpiece of our childhood. Every day after school, we'd gather up at Brandon's, elbows and knee pads pressed against the chain link fence in anticipation. Brandon was the king of our little kingdom, granting VIP access to me, his right-hand man, simply, well, because I lived the closest. The trampoline wasn't just a toy, it was a magnet that pulled the whole neighborhood together. Kids would line up after school, waiting for their turn to jump. Even older kids, ones who wouldn't have given us the time of day otherwise, would wander over, pretending not to care until Brandon invited them over to try a backflip. Summers were punctuated by the squeak of the trampoline springs and the shouts of "double jump me." Everybody tried to perfect their tricks, pushing the limits of what was possible without cracking or breaking a bone. I think the best part though was the sleepovers. Brandon's dad always grinning like he was in on a secret, and claimed that sleeping on the trampoline was this rite of passage. "Every kid's got to do it at least once," he said, wagging a spatula during one of his weekend barbecue sermons. The idea was thrilling, dozing underneath the stars, surrounded by that faint hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. That summer, Brandon and I decided it was time to step up. It was our time to do it. That night started out like most of our sleepovers. Brandon's mom made us some burgers and fries. We ate until our stomachs hurt, then spent hours outside bouncing under that faded glow of the evening sky. By the time the stars emerged, we were lying side by side on the trampoline, staring up at the vast, glittering expanse. That trampoline smelled of rubber and grass, and a familiar mix that seemed to amplify that feeling of complete freedom as a child. We'd talk about that normal stuff, teachers we hated, video games we wanted, and, of course, girls. Brandon always had a crush, though the names kind of changed weekly. I mostly would just listen, offering up the occasional grunt of agreement as he would dissect the complex signals that he thought he was getting from a girl who sat behind him in math class. Before you know it, midnight had rolled around, and neither of us were asleep yet. The stillness of the neighborhood had turned eerie now. The usual suburban noises like car engines, distant laughter, was replaced by this oppressive quiet. Brandon rolled over onto his side, face lit by the faint glow from his digital watch. "Let's jump," he said. "Now?" I asked him, glancing toward the house. The windows were dark, save for this faint light inside Brandon's parents' room. "Yeah, come on," he urged. "We can say that we jumped at midnight. How many kids can say that?" I hesitated, but the gleam in his eye was infectious. We clambered to our feet, springs creaking in protest as we started bouncing. Our laughter broke the stillness and carried away by the warm summer breeze. For a moment, it felt like we were the only people in the world. And that's, well, when I saw him. The first time, I thought it was just imagining things. A trick of the shadows or the way the street lights stretched across the asphalt. It had to be that. I'd just been double jumped by Brandon, soaring higher than I'd ever gone before. And for a brief moment, the trampoline seemed to vanish beneath me, and I had the best view of our entire block. And that's when I saw that man. He was standing in the middle of the street, just a few houses down, illuminated faintly by the streetlight above him. He wasn't moving, wasn't swaying like somebody waiting for a ride, just standing there. His face was damn near impossible to make out in the distance, but his silhouette was sharp, broad shoulders, long arms hanging awkwardly at his side. Something about the way he just stood silent sent a chill through me, even though it was a warm summer night. I hit the trampoline a little harder than I expected to, stumbling as the springs groaned beneath me. Brandon laughed, oblivious to my expression. "Dude, you okay?" he asked, bouncing in place, still caught up in the exhilaration. "There's somebody over there," I stammered, pointing over to the street. Brandon squinted, following my gaze, but he couldn't see over the fence like I could. Where?" "Double jump me, come on," he said, with a grin creeping across his face. "I'll check it out." "Brandon, I'm serious. Just do it, man. If there's a guy out there, I want to see him." Reluctantly, I crouched low, timing the bounce perfectly to send him flying into the air. Brandon let out a whoop, twisting his body mid-jump as he scanned the street. He landed with a thud and his smile was now gone. "Yeah, there is somebody," he said. "He's just standing there." We stared at one another for a beat, trampoline wobbling slightly beneath our weight. Then, as if we silently agreed to confirm what we saw, we both jumped, higher and higher, gaining better views with each bounce. Each jump, the man seemed to get closer, his form growing larger and clearer, though each time he was eerily still. By that fourth jump, we just stopped. "He's moving," Brandon whispered. "What do you mean?" I hissed back. He's closer, like way closer." My stomach churned as I climbed to my knees, gripping the edge of the trampoline. The fence was way too high to see over without jumping, so part of me didn't even want to look again. "Let's just go inside," I said. Brandon opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, we heard the faintest crunch of gravel. We froze. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Deliberate and unnervingly close. We turned towards the back gate, the only entrance to the yard besides the house. The latch didn't rattle, the hinges didn't creak, but those footsteps stopped just beyond the fence. "Did you even see him come this way?" I whispered. Brandon shook his head. We stayed perfectly still, straining to hear anything else, any sound, any movement. Then came the first tap. It was soft, almost polite, against those wooden planks of the fence. Tap, tap. Then silence. Brandon's eyes widened as he mouthed to me, "What do we do?" Before we could answer, there was a second tap, harder this time, and the sound of wood creaking. My heart stopped as I watched a pair of hands, gnarled and dirty, grip the top of the fence. The man's head followed, a wild tangle of bushy hair and a thick, unkempt beard, framing a face that didn't belong anywhere near this quiet suburban street. His teeth were yellow and uneven, lips cracked, but it was his eyes that terrified me the most, these wide, unblinking things that were locked onto us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Run!" Brandon whispered. We slid off the trampoline as quietly as we could, moving in sync towards the back door. The man didn't move, he just watched us, hands still gripping the fence. For a moment, I thought we might make it. And then he climbed over. I heard the sound of his boots hitting the grass, and it jolted us into action. We bolted, sprinting for the house as his footsteps pounded behind us. I didn't dare look back. Brandon reached for the door first, yanking it open as we tumbled inside, slamming it shut and locking it all in one motion. "Mom! Dad!" Brandon screamed. His parents quickly appeared at the top of the stairs, bleary-eyed and alarmed. "What's going on?" his dad demanded. "There's a guy in the backyard. He chased us," Brandon yelled, pointing out back. Brandon's dad didn't even hesitate, grabbed a baseball bat from the closet by the door and flicked on the backyard light. That yellow glow spilled onto the grass, but the yard was empty now. "You two stay inside," he said, stepping off onto the porch. "Wait!" Brandon's mom called after him, but he was already halfway across the yard, flashlight beam sweeping over the grass. We crowded by the window, our breath fogging the glass as we continued to watch his father, the trampoline looming in the center of the yard. "There!" I whispered, pointing. Something moved underneath the trampoline, a dark shape shifting ever so slightly. "He's under there," Brandon whispered, clutching his mom's arm. We pounded on the glass, trying to warn Brandon's dad, but he didn't hear us. The figure rolled out from under the trampoline, moving so fast, way faster than I expected. He darted around the side of the house and disappeared towards the front yard, just as Brandon's dad turned the flashlight towards the trampoline. Brandon's mom rushed to the front window, pulling back the curtain just in time to see the man sprinting down the street, that wild hair bouncing with every step. He didn't look back, not once. He vanished off into the darkness. Brandon's mom called the police, voice trembling as she gave them the details. "A man in our backyard, he chased our boys. He's gone now, but..." She trailed off, glancing at the front window, like she expected him to suddenly reappear. Operator promised to send officers immediately, but that didn't feel immediate enough. We were all still at the back window, watching Brandon's dad. He prowled the yard with the flashlight, beam jittering as he swept it over the fence, then the trampoline, and the shadows pooling in every corner. We could hear him saying something, I'm assuming calling out to the man, daring him to show himself, but we couldn't hear the words through that thick glass. "I don't like this," Brandon's mom muttered, biting her lip. She pressed her hand against the window, tapping to get his attention, but he never looked back. He was far too focused on the perimeter. My gut twisted then. "I should have told him," I whispered. "Told him what?" Brandon asked. "That he was hiding under the trampoline," I said. "What if he's still out here?" Brandon's mom froze, her hand still against the window. Slowly she turned to us, her face pale. "Under the trampoline?" Brandon nodded. But before he could say any more, that floodlight flickered once, twice, and went out, plunging the backyard into darkness. The flashlight's beam reappeared, bobbing wildly as Brandon's dad turned towards the house. He said something like, "It's fine," or "Stay inside." The glass muffled everything though, and the yard seemed eerily quiet now. Then I saw movement, not in the backyard and not in the street, but on the other side of the window, pressed against the glass. The man's face appeared so suddenly it felt like a punch to the chest. His wild hair and beard framed this grin that was even more grotesque up close. His teeth were cracked and filthy, gums far too red, and his eyes, those eyes, they seemed to bulge from their sockets as they flicked between me and Brandon. He pressed his palms flat against the glass, leaving these greasy smears as he tilted his head. Nobody moved. The only sound was Brandon's mom's sharp intake of breath, like she couldn't believe what she was actually seeing. Then the man opened up his mouth, not to speak, not to yell, but to press his tongue against the glass, dragging it in this slow, disgusting motion. Brandon screamed first. Then his mom snapped out of her trance and grabbed both of us, shoving us behind her as she scrambled for the phone. She didn't stop to look back at the window, didn't even try to process what she was seeing. "Get away from the window!" she shrieked. And I didn't need to be told twice. I followed Brandon into the living room, where we crouched behind the couch. We could still hear his mom shouting into the phone, but her voice sounded distant now, muffled by the blood rushing in my ears. Is he still there?" Brandon whispered. "I don't know," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true or not, and honestly I didn't want to know. Then we heard this big, loud, hollow bang, like somebody hitting the back door. Brandon flinched and grabbed my arm. "He's trying to get in." It stopped just as quickly as it started, then replaced by another noise, this scraping sound. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the house. "He's walking around," I said. "Where's my dad?" Brandon then asked, his eyes darting towards the back window. That flashlight beam was gone though. Brandon's mom burst into the room, phone still clutched in her hand. "The police are on their way," she said, voice shaking. "We're locking all the doors and staying together." She then bolted for the front door, twisting the lock and peeking through the peephole. "He's not out front," she said. Her tone wasn't relieved, but it was weary. We huddled together in the living room, Brandon's mom gripping the baseball bat now, her knuckles white. Every noise, every creak of the floor, the rustle of the leaves outside, felt amplified, unnatural. The sirens finally arrived, blue and red lights splashing across the walls. 2 officers knocked on the door. Brandon's mom explained everything in a rush, so they listened and nodded, then stepped out into the yard, their flashlights now cutting through the darkness. We watched from every window, barely even daring to take a breath. The officers swept the yard and checked the trampoline, even walked the perimeter of the fence. But the man was gone. "Must have run off when we heard us coming," one of the officers said. His tone was calm and dismissive, almost like we imagined the whole thing. "We saw him though," Brandon insisted. "He was right there." The officer then crouched slightly, looking into Brandon's eye. "I believe you, kid," he said, though his expression said otherwise. "But he's not here now. You're all safe." Safe. That word felt hollow. The officers stayed for another hour, patrolling the neighborhood and taking a few notes, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no handprints on the fence, nothing. When they left, that silence in the house was unbearable. Brandon's dad returned, looking sheepish and frustrated that he missed everything. Brandon's mom barely spoke a word. Her eyes were darting to the windows every few seconds. We didn't sleep that night. We sat on the couch and stared at the curtains, waiting for another tap or another scrape, waiting to see that face again. To my knowledge, the police never found him. And all these years later, I'll still never look at a trampoline the same way. Okay, here goes. I have a medical background and a certification that I rarely use, though I keep going back and paying to renew it. Random, I know, but it pertains to my story. Almost immediately after Katrina, I volunteered, wanting to help anybody and everybody I could. A few of us were assigned once the water started to recede to find houses that had dead bodies in them. If you've ever had to do a body recovery when it's been lying around in the heat and the water for days, sometimes even weeks at a time, you know the smell I'm talking about. It does not smell like any other dead carcass. It's just worse. I can't explain it. If you know, you know. The key to help with the smell is to place a little bit of Vicks underneath your nose. It doesn't keep the smell out completely, but enough so you can at least tolerate the smell without vomiting. During my time volunteering, we had to go to each house, go inside with wading boots and look for bodies. Many of them did indeed get washed out to sea, but some were unfortunately still in the house. If we found a body, we would have to spray paint a big X on the outside of the house. This other guy and I had been doing it for quite a while, and we got assigned to each other almost every single day. We got along pretty good for the most part, and he didn't vomit at the ones that had been gotten to. One day, we came up to this old shack, and I say shack because it was really run down in what would have been a really bad neighborhood. Right away, for some reason, I get chills down my spine, and this feeling of something wrong encompasses me. And not wrong like find a body kind of wrong, but chilling, disturbing, weird. New Orleans has certain areas that just give off these vibes, and my understanding is there's still a lot of voodoo practiced in certain areas. Going against every instinct in my body, I go inside. The smell hit me almost immediately, and the second thing was some kind of earthy and mold scent. I glanced at my partner, I'll call him Jay for the story's sake. He was white as a sheet. I could tell he was getting that same feeling that I'd been getting. It was obvious from the weird bones hanging from the ceiling. It was quite obvious from the bones hanging from the ceiling, and I would bet money they were cat bones, that something odd had been going down in the house, as well as beads and carvings in the bare wood of the walls. We moved into what would have been the kitchen. Chained to a beam was an old lady, or what was left of her. She had chained herself by the wrist to the beam. Her guts were literally falling out of the floor. By far though, the creepiest thing was her face still looked as though she were alive, staring at us with this wicked smile, showing only partial teeth. My skin immediately started crawling as the goosebumps spread all over my body and my neck hair stood up. Suddenly, I heard the most unearthly cackling noise that I've ever heard in my life, and flight or fight kicked in. Jay and I immediately noped out of there, painted that X, and literally ran to the next house. I don't know if that old lady had practiced voodoo or whatever, but being inside there, hearing whatever I heard, scared the ever-loving shit out of me, and it still gives me nightmares to this day. The people that I really feel sorry for are the ones who actually had to take the bodies out, like that crazy lady chained to a beam. Jay and I ended up discussing it that night after we were back at our hotels, just north of there. He said he heard the cackling too, but we both said it had to be the wind, or something else, right? Hey Boos, I listen to your channel almost every single night. These stories tend to help me get to sleep. My therapist said it might be due to being addicted to stress because we live inside this very stressful society. Whatever that makes me, I don't know. I just know that I have a few things I could tell folks. Back in February of 2024, I got a job as a pest control technician. I work for a small company that literally has 5 people working inside it, myself included. I was their first hire outside of their family, and honestly, it's the best job I've had so far. I'm not really one to get grossed out too easily, so this makes me pretty good at the job itself. I grew up on a farm and I shoveled shit since I was very young. Seen some nasty stuff. My boss even told me I handled the gross situations a lot better than newcomers. Now, I'm not supposed to say exactly where things have happened and who I've worked for because it can get people into trouble. So I can only say that I was servicing this cell phone joint that had a rat problem. This was a previous client of ours and they're located in a seriously rough neighborhood. Because of this, we had to raise our rates, so they terminated our contract, but they ended up calling us back a few weeks later, saying they couldn't find anybody else to provide service for them, so that's where I step in. When it comes to rodent control, we tell the customers how to prevent rodents from getting in. Usually tell them some caulk or cement to fix the cracks and holes. It turns out this place was a main target for drunk drivers. It had been crashed into 4 times in the past year. The owner couldn't afford to fix every crack, so we had to show up every single week to keep the rats in the basement at the very least. Well, the thing about rats though is they're very smart, beyond crafty. With the structural damage to this building, the rodents pretty much had free reign. We'd been trying everything, excluding exterior pre-bait traps, which should have been working, and they weren't, which is a huge red flag. So we decided to try something different this time. Instead of the usual bait, we set out candy, chips, and other gas station snacks. Definitely not my first choice, but nothing else was working. I show up a little early that day. The place opened at 9:30. I got there around 9:20ish. Usually when I get there, it's much earlier, but as mentioned, this was a bad neighborhood. I'm a young white dude in uniform. Not to cross any lines, but I catch a lot of glares and bad looks when I show up in these areas, so I try to not spend a lot of time there, if I don't have to. I poked around the job site, saw a few of the rat traps had been moved, but none of them had caught anything yet. I tell the owner what's going on and then head back to the truck to grab a few fresh bait stations, as well as the strongest poison that we're allowed to legally use. If the rats were just gonna eat the poison, I was gonna make sure it at least had some sort of effect. I parallel parked in front of this black car, and I drive a pretty big rig, so it's typical for me. The car has big tires and gold and fancy rims. And if you're from around here, you know what that means. This guy is most likely a drug dealer. This cell phone store is located on a four-way intersection, and I, along with this car, are parked on the south side of that intersection. I walk around in my truck on that far side that was facing the sidewalk, opposite side of the traffic. I unlock my truck, reach for the bait station, and as soon as I did that, I hear bang, 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 bang. I'd say around 12 bangs go off right next to me. The forecast over there was going to be rain, so my dumbass thought that there was lightning, so I looked up in the sky. Only when a car next to me burned some rubber peeling off did I realize what had actually happened. The car I was standing right next to got shot at. A drive-by took place not 3 feet from me, and my head was in the clouds. There's glass all over the sidewalk. I felt like this extra in a movie. I looked around and was expecting somebody to do something. I'm thinking to myself, is somebody gonna call the cops? But then an older lady walks up to me and says, "Officer, are you all right? I think he was aiming for you." I realize everybody thinks that I'm already on scene or some shit, and I just explained to the bystander that I'm pest control, not a police officer. I finish setting up the bait traps, and only then when I get back in my truck does it hit me how close to death I really was. Had I grabbed that bait station 30 seconds earlier, I would have been walking around the black car to get to the sidewalk, and I definitely would have been hit. Called my boss and told him about what happened. We ended up firing the customer, and he bitched about what he was gonna do. My boss literally told him to close up shop and move on. The danger wasn't even worth it. Now, that was the craziest thing that's ever happened to me, but not the worst thing I've ever seen. I had this call for a quarterly for this apartment complex. It's summer, so I'm treating the perimeter to prevent any stinging insects. I typically like these jobs because it makes me walk around a lot. I fill up these gallons of water and walk back to my truck. I mix some chemicals and pour it into my backpack sprayer. I then walk back to the spigot where the water had come from. And then I spot another spigot maybe 20 feet to my left. I'm thinking about step count for the day. Think that burning 1 or 2 more calories wouldn't hurt anything. I walk over to that further one, kneel down and start filling up my jugs. As I do so, I kind of zone out for a second, then turn my head to my right. I look down in front of those U-shaped gutter things that are in front of basement windows, and I see some blowflies that are coming out of it. Being an expert on bugs now, I know that blowflies come from some kind of dead flesh. So I peek a little further down in the gutter and see something that I wish I hadn't. Makes me nauseous to think about to this day. Now remember, I've seen filthy, roach-infested buildings, but this couldn't even come close to what I was seeing. There was this Walmart bag that was ripped open, and I saw 2 little puppy heads sticking out of the hole. I was stunned. Being a lover of dogs, I felt violated. How could somebody do something like this? Get puppies, bag them up, and then throw them in a gutter. Immediately, I became overwhelmed with emotion. I I thought about calling off the job, but looked at the cost of the ticket. I knew my boss would be upset with me if I did so, but I just ended up finishing the job. Still, that guilt was heavy. I wanted to do something. So I got some gloves, went back over to the pups, reached down, and almost threw up when I touched them. I couldn't do it. Despite all that goodwill and desire to bury them, it was too gross to actually handle. I wanted to give them a proper burial, but there just wasn't enough left. I know it might sound weird coming from an exterminator about valuing a small animal's life, but I've lived with dogs since I was 8 years old. Dogs are family, and seeing them handled with the lack of morality completely crushed me. I ended up going home and threw up and cried for over an hour. I lost a lot of faith in humanity that day. I just discovered this sub, and I've been reading a lot of your stories. Some of them are pretty frightening. I have a tale from a long time ago that I thought I would share with you. I think it belongs here, and I hope I don't bore you. I am now a 72-year-old man, and this happened a long time ago, but I remember it very well. The background was a series of events that placed me inside a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Let's just say my life at the time was in disarray. I dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity came to move to an isolated cabin. To live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months long. No TV, but books and a radio. I had a library card, but I don't remember if I even had a phone. My story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around that cabin. It's hard to describe or put into words, but I felt like somebody was just watching. On many occasions, I thought somebody might even be looking into my cabin window, watching me. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks half a mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me though. I felt that presence following me closely in the woods behind me in the darkness. You could hear it too, footsteps in the woods. It picked up its pace as I did. This was not only happening to me, it happened to my younger brother who visited me and to a few other friends. It spooked all of them big time. At night, it had to be out there, around the cabin. But here's the funny thing. I was never really afraid, never really felt threatened. Not at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a lot of time wandering those vast areas of the woodland around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I would come across evidence of campsites, recent ones at that, in the woods. Traces of fire, old abandoned buildings that would have corners that gave shelter and looked like they'd been slept in recently. Garbage, food and drink, wrappers, what have you. Perhaps it was hunters, but much of it did not have that organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. During that last month of stay, that's when things intensified. Maybe it sensed that I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had this small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps off to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard, with woods close on either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps on many mornings. Small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day. almost like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog would eat them. This went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was woken up by some sound. I was laying in bed when I heard something on the porch. I hopped up and hit the lights and saw that hound dog, who'd never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect point position. She was shaking in fear, but she never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit that spotlight, but saw nothing. I went out. It had been on the porch at my front door, maybe even trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. This wasn't funny anymore. The final 2 gifts that I received were legs from either horses or cows, big and bloody, and one was skinned. On the second to last day I was out there, the dog left me. I could hear her far out in the woods howling on the trail, following some kind of scent. I looked for her in every way I could, and came up in following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I ended up moving back to Maryland, the suburbs of DC, got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not too long after I picked up the Washington Post, I saw an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall Yeti-like creature, fur-covered on 2 legs, that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. That attention described in the article was exactly what had happened to me, following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I'd turned that spotlight on and seen a Bigfoot or a Yeti, I might still be running. Thinking back now on who it might have been, Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods, especially growing up that way, country folks. I believe the monster was an escaped patient or just some kind of free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to quote-unquote adopt. Those campsites in the woods that I seen could have easily been him. With nothing else to do, he would make mischief. Maybe he liked me, and maybe he sensed I was leaving. Obviously, I can't prove any of this, it's just a theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case around then. I do not think he could have survived until the 1980s. The deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw a lot of mentally ill off into the streets and took away the shelter of the hospitals. Unfortunately, unprotected, most of them would have passed away. My name is Patrick Beverly. You might know me as an NBA basketball player. I most notably played for the Houston Rockets, and I'm now playing in Israel. It sounds wild, but I spent a lot of my time traveling, and I listen to podcasts just like this one. Before I went pro, I used to do some pretty bad things, like selling drugs to different people. I only did it because me and my mother were very poor and wanted to make it out of the hood, which thankfully eventually we did. We lived in a rough neighborhood inside Chicago in a 1-bedroom apartment. My mother worked 3 jobs getting paid on minimum wage. Yeah, that's how poor we were. My aunt and cousins would sometimes take turns watching me as an infant. As I got older, my mom would date these drug dealer boyfriend types, which inspired me to sell drugs. One night in August of 2008, I met up with my homeboy Donovan. I sold him some dope and smoked it with him. I don't remember exactly how high I got, but I do remember that I went off the rails that time. After finishing the deal, I went home in my white Dodge Magnum. I was really driving under the influence, and it was a really bad idea, I know. As I approached an intersection, there were no cars in front of me. I thought the light was green, but in reality, it was red. As I was crossing that intersection running the red light, I collided with another vehicle. My car flipped 3 times. I was not wearing a seatbelt, and the windows were down. I honestly have no idea how I even survived that crash. I was able to climb out of the car without a scratch, surprisingly. And then I heard somebody call out to me that was in front of me. As my eyes were still adjusting from all the weed and everything else that just happened, I saw the guy standing outside next to a car with his hazards on. He said he had my phone and it flew out of my car, so I asked him to call the ambulance, saying it loudly as I was still trying to catch my breath. A few moments later, the EMTs arrived, and I told them my story. They were all amazed and shocked that I was even standing. How the hell was I alive? I was fine physically, but emotionally, it left a scar that has not healed to this day. A few weeks after my incident, something even more tragic happened. I was driving a new car, and Donovan was in the car with me. We were just shooting dice at the street corner and now driving off to the park. We hung out for a little while, and then I decided to go back to my grandmother's place. I kept insisting for him to come with me, but he told me he'd meet up with me later. So I just left, leaving him behind. This would ultimately be a big mistake, and I'm still regretting it to this day. Not too long after driving off and getting back to my grandmother's place, I got a call from a nearby hospital, was told that my friend Donovan had been shot multiple times and was dead. I was at a loss for words. My brother, my friend, was dead, the closest person to me in the world. I then called my mom, and even she cried like a baby. I picked her up. We went to the hospital together. Once there, we had to identify Donovan because he wasn't carrying any ID at the time. I should have never brought him over there in the first place, and I don't know what I was thinking. I would have nightmares for months straight after this. I know this also sounds crazy, but after Donovan died, I would sometimes talk to him like a ghost, even though I was basically talking to thin air. A few days after he died, I ended up getting a call to play pro basketball in Ukraine. I accepted the contract because there was really no other options, and I love basketball more than anything, and now I would actually earn money playing basketball, and my family could use the money that I would earn. I also did this for Donovan in his memory. I know he would have wanted me to keep going no matter what. Donovan, I hope you're proud of me up there. I've made some accomplishments that I'm pretty proud of, like making the NBA obviously, and having some accolades along with it, which including getting 3 All-NBA defensive teams. I love you, Donovan. This story's for you. I'll see you soon and we'll reunite in heaven, but I still got some stuff to do. Hey guys, I'm a long-time listener here. I love putting on these stories to keep me company when I'm busy. Honestly, most paranormal stories remind me of creepypastas. So over the top, they lose me almost right away. But this, it's different. I've wanted to share it for a long time, and now it feels like the right time. I'm an OEF combat veteran, a proud FMF corpsman with multiple deployments underneath my belt. I've seen plenty of wild things, stuff that could really make anybody question reality. Nerves? Sure. Nights spent working in Guantanamo Bay Hospital with only the ER open, so yeah, those can rattle you. But nothing I've ever experienced compares to what happened inside my childhood home. When I was about 10 years old, my parents split. My mom tried that single life for a while until she reconnected with her little brother's old friend, somebody that she'd grown up with for 15 years. What started as catching up quickly turned into something more, and before I knew it, my sister and I were moving inside his house. A house that I would come to know intimately and fear deeply. At first glance, it was just a regular early 2000s bachelor pad. Incense always burning, band posters plastered across the walls, dragon sculptures, and skull decor scattered everywhere. It was pretty much everything you'd expect, but beneath the surface, the house carried this history that weighed heavy. It was built in the 1930s and was originally a funeral home next to a mortician's house. It had housed a full crematorium and parlor for wakes, features that didn't just disappear when the building was converted into a home. The layout was even unsettling. The upstairs was open, this airy space with a narrow staircase, divided only by these thin walls. A small closet with a piece of wood bolted into the studs, and it covered what looked like a hole leading to nowhere. Downstairs, the front room was once a gathering space for mourners, and that became my bedroom. I later learned it served as a viewing room for caskets. The office where the funeral arrangements were handled became my parents' room. One feature that haunted me from day one was this small window above the porch. The only way to access that space was through the window itself, and it shared a wall with the upstairs room. My dad once tried to do some work inside that space, but as soon as he turned around, the window slammed shut on its own. When he did so, he saw something, a little boy with a train spike lodged in his forehead, staring back at him with these empty, emotionless eyes. Then there was also children upstairs. The girl had either a cat's face or wore a mask that looked like one, but the boy was far worse. His body was burned to a crisp, as if he'd been consumed by a fire. These children weren't the only visitors. They just made their presence known often, playing with my stepdad's daughter whenever they were upstairs. There was also a female spirit who seemed to watch over them, perhaps even guiding their play. So one night, the downstairs AC unit caught fire, filling the house with smoke. After the fire was out, my stepdad went upstairs and gathered his daughter's things. Every toy that had been scattered across the room was now tucked neatly into the closet with a wooden patch. At first, it was kind of eerie, but looking back, I think it might have been the children and that female spirit protecting the toys, ensuring that they wouldn't catch fire. Those toys weren't just things, they were part of the world the spirits had shared with those living children. There was also this cowboy, and this wasn't some playful child spirit. It was an old man with a deep southern drawl, the kind of voice you'd expect from somebody who smoked every single day of his life. Whenever I defied my stepdad, that cowboy would make his presence known. I'd hear the jingle of his spurs, or worse, he'd slam every drawer in my desk open and shut, over and over, until I got the message. Sometimes he'd mess with my electronics, shutting off my boombox or freezing my PlayStation mid-game. It was like he had taken it upon himself to enforce respect, especially when it came to my stepdad. At night, my stepdad would say that the cowboy would climb the stairs, his spurs clicking into the hardwood floor. He'd sit in the rocking chair where my stepdad played guitar, and the two would talk for a while before he would wander off into the house. His presence wasn't comforting, it felt like a shadow always hanging over us, heavy and watchful. Years later, when I came back to the house, those strange occurrences returned as if they'd been waiting for me specifically. Friends who stayed over long nights of drinking heard those same spurs on the stairs and heavy breathing from the closet. Shadows moved in the upstairs room, and nobody wanted to step on the staircase at night. I gave my 3-year-old son a room upstairs, but he would rarely use it. One night during a game night, I asked him to sleep there, and moments later he came running downstairs, screaming that the cat-faced girl and the burnt boy and this lady had been watching him from his pirate ship bed. I like to believe they meant no harm, but he refused to ever go upstairs again. Eventually, I ended up moving upstairs myself, thinking it would be the perfect tactical position if anybody tried to break in. While moving my furniture, I dropped the chest of drawers, smashing a hole in the wall next to the closet's patch. That atmosphere changed instantly. The air thickened and a dark, oppressive wave washed over the house. I patched that hole as quickly as I could, throwing open every window and blasting music to drive out that darkness. Once it was sealed again, the house seemed to settle back into its all too familiar eerie calm. But that unsettling, watchful presence never really left. Leaving the house for good, it turned out to be harder than I expected it to be. On my final day, I brought a friend to help pack. As we turned off the lights, we noticed the upstairs light was still on. I asked him if he could go turn it off, assuming he'd been the one up there earlier. He agreed, not knowing the house's history. A few moments later, I heard him scream, this gut-wrenching, terrified scream. He flew down the stairs, nearly tearing the screen door off its hinges. The front door slammed shut behind him, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps. He grabbed me by the shoulders. His face was pale and he was dripping with sweat now. "What the fuck is in that house?" he asked, shaking me. He said as soon as he got to the top of the stairs and turned that light off, he heard footsteps behind him, and something passed through him, shoving him backward as if he was trying to keep him there. He forced his way down the stairs, only to hear the stampede of boots, bare feet, and spurs chasing him all the way out. That night I felt this deep sadness, and not just for my friend, but for the spirits that we left behind. It felt like they'd grown attached to us after all these years, and now they were losing their connection to the living world. Now, nothing in that house ever truly felt malevolent, except for whatever lingered inside that closet and that hole that I accidentally opened near it. I haven't been back since. My grandfather fixed up the house for sale and never really asked him what became of it. And that's my story about the Weinert House.